It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. A big change to the assisted dying bill. Supporters say it will still be robust.
I think by adding these extra safeguards, adding the extra multidisciplinary expertise, all headed by a High Court judge, that is a real improvement to the bill.
There was a process in place and that's what MPs voted for in November, and now that process is being changed.
This is the beginning of making America rich again.
President Trump imposes tariffs on steel and aluminium imports. What will it mean for Britain?
I don't believe that his tariffs are actually directly targeted at us, but of course that shouldn't make us complacent.
This businesswoman tells us how she's preparing for the economic uncertainty ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
And this was 50 years ago. What can today's politicians learn from Margaret Thatcher? Joining me today, Labour MP Josh Simons, Conservative MP Ben Spencer, Grace Blakely from Tribune magazine and Kate Andrews from The Spectator. This is Politics Live. Well, as we saw in the headlines, it's 50 years since Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party. Let's take a look at what she told the media exactly 50 years ago today.
To me, it's like a dream that the next name in the line, Harold Macmillan, Alec Douglas Hume and Edward Heath, is Margaret Thatcher. Each has brought his own style of leadership and stamp of greatness to the task. I shall take on the work with humility and dedication. There is much to do, and I hope you will allow me time to do it thoughtfully and well.
Starting with you, Kate, opening question. What can politicians today learn from Margaret Thatcher's leadership?
I think the right always makes a big mistake when it invokes the spirits of Thatcher and Reagan, because it's just a reminder about how little they have in common with those politicians these days. I mean, the UK is taxing and spending at record levels, and it was brought there by the Conservative Party. But it's a good question, what can be learned? Because I think what Thatcher, one of the ways that she was so unique as a politician is that she actually grappled with the really difficult issues of the day, exchange controls, monopolies. She was willing to ruffle feathers, and you can't transplant those ideas to today. So much of that has been dealt with, and there's broad consensus that it was correct. What politicians need to deal with today is the National Health Service, the state pension, the really tricky things to talk about, especially around elections. And I don't think that has to be a lesson for just the right. It's a lesson for the left too. And indeed, Labour talks about addressing these issues. And maybe over the next 6 months, year, 5 years, we'll find out what they have planned.
What do you think today's politicians across the board can or can't learn from Margaret Thatcher's leadership?
Well, I think much of the economy and the society that we live in today is a legacy of Thatcherism. And I think fixing many of the problems that we face today comes actually back to undoing Thatcherism. So we have low wages, we have a low wage economy. That's in part because Thatcher used the power of the state to crush our unions. We have a bloated finance sector and very high levels of inequality because of the deregulation of the finance sector. And obviously that has brought us to the brink of collapse as an economy many times. But I think more than that, Thatcher, when she said there's no such thing as society, her entire political philosophy was about unleashing the spirit of competitive individualism. It was about convincing us that we are all alone, that we are isolated individuals who have to compete against one another just to survive. And that's the kind of, I suppose, isolated and lonely society that we have today, as well as one in which people don't feel that they have power to take on the vested interests that control our country.
Would you want to respond, first of all, to what you've just heard there from Grace in terms of her outlining Margaret Thatcher's legacy?
Yeah, I mean, we go about some saying, I guess, I wouldn't agree with that sort of portrayal of Thatcher and Thatcherism. I think for me, the key is that she demonstrates the importance and strength of inspirational and strong leadership. And I think it's absolutely right to say this isn't it's not a party political point. I think all parties can see the benefit from having that strength of leadership. And whether people agree or disagree with the individual policies or approaches, you knew where you stand, you knew where Margaret Thatcher was going, you knew her vision for the country. And I think that's really important, especially at times of economic problems, all the problems that we've got in the world, that's strong and inspirational leadership that's focused on making our country fantastic.
I mean, Keir Starmer has invoked the spirit of Margaret Thatcher. He said in the 1980s the Thatcher government deregulated finance capital. In the new Labour era, globalisation increased the opportunities for trade. This is our equivalent, talking about deregulation and going for growth. What else do you think politicians today can learn from Margaret Thatcher?
Well, it is striking, the list of prime ministers that Thatcher named just before her own, and what heavyweights, serious thinkers they were. Compare that with the Conservative Party now, leader of the opposition who refuses to set out any policies. And I'm sorry to make the partisan point, but I think it's important. Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, Kemi Badenoch, that does not quite have the same ring to it of serious heavyweight leaders with the vision, determination and grit that you seem to want from your leader.
Well, I'll let Ben respond and then you'll answer the question.
What really struck me at that video that we've just seen of Margaret Thatcher is that she finished off with saying, I hope I have the time and the space to be thoughtful and to make the right decisions. And that's exactly what we're seeing Kemi Badenoch say in terms of space to think this properly. It's easy to sort of pull some policy out of the air and get some sort of headline, but that's not going to last. What the public want to see is careful decision making with a package to the country which is going to improve things going forward. People are fed up of just vox pop soundbite.
Totally agree. It's what your leader is very good at. Very bad at a big picture view of the world. Very good at vox pop.
Well, Josh, and what about the answer to the question, which is what can today's politicians learn from Margaret Thatcher?
Well, one of the striking things about that moment and that clip is it's half a century ago. And the world that Thatcher was governing in was broadly a world of peace, of prosperity, rising tide lifting all boats. We live in a world of war, of low growth chronically across Western democracies. And in that context, what it means to govern a nation is to make very difficult choices that involve trade-offs. That is a very, very different context. And I think that's what you've seen in British politics generally in recent years, is actually that in a world of war and low growth, politics is very, very, very much about trade-offs.
Well, I think the 1970s were a challenge economically, certainly, but perhaps on the war point in terms of the Cold War as well. But anyway, going back to what you heard Ben saying, has Kemi Badenoch got time, the sort of time that you heard Margaret Thatcher say?
I think she has time. I mean, if we go back to when Labour was in opposition, they weren't exactly forthcoming about all the plans that they had for government, which were learned in the budget, for example. The party could have been much more straightforward about its plan to increase national insurance on business. For example, if anything, certainly what was written in the manifesto is not in the spirit of what ended up taking place. But again, this goes back to the point about this is not a partisan issue. There is something to be learned for saying exactly what needs to be done, making the tough call. I don't think Thatcher had an easy ride of it at the time and all that she had to take on.
I think there's something to be said there, which is that this country has gone through a series of periodic transformations in the nature of our politics and economics. We had the post-war period where we had the creation of the NHS, a strong labour movement that set the foundations for that period of growth after 1945. Then we had Thatcherism, which unleashed the kind of economic model that we have today, one of very high levels of inequality, an extremely bloated and powerful finance sector, and effectively a form of oligarchy in which the powerful are able to control our politics and the economy. If we want that to change, we need another transformation on the scale of 1945 and on the scale of 1979, actually. And I've been so disappointed with a Labour Party that has come in, promised to deliver that kind of change that the country needs and has done effectively nothing. Even the changes on workers' rights, right, that look like they're now going to be watered down or even have been watered down compared to what we were promised, that is something that would have undone some of Thatcherism, that would have gone some way to healing those scars, and it's just not happened.
Josh?
Well, it's extremely confusing that the Employment Rights Bill, which is the most significant piece of employment rights legislation that will make work secure, it will make work paid better, that comprehensive package, which is usually attacked by those who think it's a tax on business, Grace seems to think that that's not enough.
It's not.
And actually,
repeal the anti-union legislation that people like Thatcher
that is part of what the bill
Blair
does.
failed
that is
to
exactly.
repeal.
I don't know if you've read the legislation, but that is one of the major things that people like Kate criticise the bill for, is repealing.
There are lots of unions aligned with your party who have said this is not going far enough.
Who are hugely supportive of that bill.
Who have said this is not going far enough. They're struggling on the front lines against exploitative employers up and down this country, and Labour is not standing behind them.
Let's leave it there because I want to show you this headline. MP behind behind assisted dying bill suggests scrapping High Court approval. The MP is Kim Leadbeater. She is spearheading the bill to legalise assisted dying for terminally ill adults with less than 6 months to live. Now, she is suggesting now that a High Court judge will no longer have to be part of the process. It will be replaced by what she calls a panel of experts. But originally, she said the High Court judge was crucial to the process. Let's have a listen.
Under this bill, any terminally ill person who wants to be considered for an assisted death would have to undertake a thorough and robust process involving 2 doctors and a High Court judge. No other jurisdiction in the world has those layers of safeguarding.
Right, and nor are we going to have that layer of safeguarding, are we? I mean, this is going to be less safe than it was before.
Well, virtually every country in the world that has assisted dying has a process by which a panel, usually of 2 doctors, sometimes of other experts too, like psychologists, are involved in authorising a request to have assisted dying. And what this does is put the legislation that's on the table in line with all the rest of the countries. There is, to my knowledge, no other country in the world that has assisted dying that also has their top court in the land involved in that decision.
Ben?
So, I mean, in all fairness to Kim, she's listened to what's come through in terms of evidence, and she's looking at ways of improving the bill. I think what's frustrating is that I don't know whether this amendment works or not because it's not been tabled. And we have the slight bizarre situation that the committee stage is debating and voting this morning, or will be this afternoon. We're talking about safeguards, and we don't really know what these new proposed safeguards are going to be. I've got an amendment myself down regarding using a tribunal, which is a type of court, to have panel decision-making when it comes to the authorisation, which I hope it will be debated at some point as this goes forward. So
by the way, is quite close to my understanding. I mean, it will be published shortly, is my understanding. And what's going to be on the table is quite close to the tribunal idea that I think you've spoken about before. So hopefully that will go some way to, persuading you that actually the process in line is one that you might back.
I think the frustrating thing, though, just generally, and I hope it is, by the way, quite similar to what I put down.
Because you voted against it. Second reading.
Yeah, so from my position, which, bear with me, is a little bit nuanced, is I totally support the autonomy of people with full decision-making capacity, given certain caveats. But we can only vote on the bill that's in front of us. And my issue is that we weren't voting on assisted dying or physician-assisted suicide. We're voting on its implementation as in this bill. And there's lots of things that haven't been thought through. For me, particularly, the interaction with the Mental Health Act. And much has been made about how we can learn from other jurisdictions and other areas, but we have our own jurisdiction and we have our own laws. And I think one of the core problems with this bill is that it treats an expression of a wish to end one's life in the context of terminal illness as requesting a assisted death, as opposed to looking at could this be as we treat suicidal thoughts in every other context. I used to be a psychiatrist, looking to see if it could be driven by mental illness, and the majority of it is. And the bill is silent on how the Mental Health Act operates. That needs to be urgently clarified.
Josh?
I mean, it seems like you just said that the majority of people who would like the option of assisted dying, like my constituents, Brian and Denise, who I spoke to and recorded a video about at the time, are suffering from some sort of a mental affliction.
That's not what I said.
You said the majority of cases are that. What did you mean by that?
So what I said is that the majority of times when somebody expresses a desire to end their life, it's usually in the context of mental illness. That's why we have psychiatry.
Sure, but this is a specific set of cases about with 6 months left to live medically. It's not about the majority of cases in which someone says, I would like to die for no apparent reason.
I could not disagree more. I think this is the exact problem with this debate, is that it's focusing on people who are terminally ill and treating them as an exception, as opposed to looking at everything in the round. And in fact, I think actually entrenches discrimination, because what it's saying is that if you're terminally ill, you're treated differently than everybody else.
Like an assisted suicide bill rather than assisted dying at the end of life.
Well, I think this is one of the problems of the bill, is, and I've been foolish on this, because I started talking about this bill as physician-assisted suicide, because this is what it is. I then changed to calling it assisted dying because it was how it's being sold in the media, and so people can understand what I'm talking about. But I think the problem is that creates an assumption, or at least an ideological framing, that thoughts of ending one's life in terminal illness needs to be treated completely separately from thoughts of ending one's life in any other context. This is why we have psychiatrists, this is why we have psychiatric nurses, it's why we have the Mental Health Act, and this urgently needs clarifying, otherwise it's going to do great harm.
Right, I mean, the framing then of the bill overall is not something that you are going to easily be able to support, are you? Because that, the sort of thing you're talking about, is probably not up for being changed.
The framing is what it is. For me, I want to make sure that if somebody, and I've looked after people who are terminally ill, some of whom have been under the Mental Health Act. Terminal illness is a risk factor for suicide and developing depressive illnesses. I want someone who says, I want my life to end, to be treated like everybody else's in the NHS, which is assessed by a psychiatric nurse or psychiatrist. Just because you have a terminal illness doesn't make that any different. It makes it in some ways more important that they're seen by a psychiatrist because of the higher prevalence of depressive illnesses in that sort of context.
Can I get a reaction to that from the two of you before we discuss what some of the political response has been?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's been an extremely interesting conversation already. I mean, what I would say, because obviously it's not a clearly partisan political issue, but there are elements of this discussion that fall into wider areas of policy. So I'm instinctively kind of in favour of something along these lines, but I've spoken to disabled campaigners who have actually been campaigning against austerity for a very long time because it's made their lives harder. It's created untold suffering because we have cut funding for disabled people. We've made it harder for them to claim various forms of social security. We have a social care service, whether that's adult social care, children's social care, that is in a state of disrepair, people falling through the cracks left, right and centre. And that is not a context in which I want to be discussing whether or not we allow people who are suffering to die, because there is so much preventable suffering that exists across our society that we are not doing anything about.
Right, so in the end, are you and would you support a bill like this?
I think instinctively I would be in favour of something like that, just on the basis of, you know, people's civil liberties and the ability to take that decision. But I think there is a much wider question here about what we do about suffering. Do we take the easy way out and say, fine, you know, anyone should be able to end their own life and yes, there are safeguards? Or do we say we tackle that suffering at the root?
Well, because this is relatively narrow, I would suggest, in terms of someone with a terminal illness with 6 months to live, and they have to be aware of what is going on. But to go back to the change that's been announced and the difference with Kim Leadbeater having had and saying that it would be the most robust system in the world in terms of safeguards with a High Court approval, and now a panel of experts is better. This has been a flavour of some of the political reaction. Labour MP Florence Eshalomi, the key safeguard that was used to persuade MPs who raised valid questions about the bill, has now been dropped. To say this is worrying is an understatement. Can they explain why lawyers, psychiatrists and social workers won't be overwhelmed? One of the criticisms is that it would block up the courts using High Court judges just a farce. And this from the Conservative MP Danny Kruger against the bill. Approval by the High Court, the key safeguard used to sell the assisted suicide bill to MPs, has been dropped. Instead, we have a panel, not including a judge, of people committed to the process sitting in private without hearing arguments from the other side. A disgrace. I'll just get Josh to respond and then come back. What do you say to both your colleague and Danny Kruger?
So, a couple of things. First of all, my understanding of what Kim Leadbeater has proposed is that a retired High Court judge or a King's Counsel will be involved in the panel that decides whether or not that application... And that is
or really, have oversight, I think,
well,
rather
but then the decision can actually be then referred to the actual High Court. So I think that is really important detail, because it's true that the High Court has been taken out of the normal singular decision, but actually, why was it the High Court in the first place? The fact that you have a panel, you have a lawyer on it, and then it gets referred to the High Court is really important. But I would just say something that's sort of more fundamental than this. We as legislators have to decide on principles given legislation we have before us. And I think this debate is in danger of getting a little bit bogged down in process and procedural arguments when if you go and talk to voters in this country, to my constituents, what they care about is the principle. And fundamentally, they believe that that principle is that they should have the right to choose, given that that capacity is available, how they want to end their life. And I think if we duck deciding on that principle, we will live to regret it.
But this was a key safeguard of the bill, as espoused by Kim Leadbeater herself. What do you make of the response, and what's your response?
Well, I think a lot of trust will have been broken with this major change.
Oh, you do? I
do, and I think that process when it comes to deciding whether or not somebody lives or dies is in fact incredibly important.
Of course, and I said that.
But you said that we're at risk of being bogged down in the process. The process is fundamental to whether or not somebody's going to live or die. Well, let's speak about that principle. I'm similar to Grace. My instincts are that at the very end of life, when you are in pain and it is an incurable situation, there has to be scope to be sympathetic to that. But is this country in any place at the moment to get something like this over the line for all the reasons that have just been pointed out? It feels like it is being pushed through. The safeguards are being dropped. Nobody believes that the NHS or the court system is in a place to deal with this right now. When you have 7 million people on an NHS waiting list, to be talking about whether or not you're going to support assisted dying feels like the wrong priority at hand. And thank you so much for your comments, because I think they're in some ways very difficult to say out loud, because you get the typical political response. So you're saying people can't make a decision for themselves. I'm coming from the perspective that we should give people liberty in practically every circumstance that we can. And yet a lot of the evidence, particularly the medical evidence here, is being tossed aside for broader talk of principles. If we want to talk about life and death, especially in the UK, a country that, similar to the US, is at the bottom end of the list for avoidable deaths within its health service, perhaps there's a wider conversation to be had about principle, absolutely, and maybe it isn't about assisted dying right now.
Josh?
We are the world's 6th, 7th largest economy. We are one of the greatest and most effective states that exist in this world.
Not when it comes to healthcare.
We can, if we choose to, despite what 14 years of the Conservative Party have tried to do to this country, we can, if we choose to, give people a dignified, who have 6 months left to live, a dignified way to die. And this idea that it actually is reducible to mental health is, I think, really dangerous. My grandparents both died very slowly of Alzheimer's. One of them, my grandma, I kept pushing her past the medicine cupboard where the medicine was stored. She knew that in there was the answer to her pain, but she was not allowed to access it. Principle matters, because at the end of the day, we have this bill on the table. The last time we spoke about a bill like this was 10 years ago. And if we get bogged down in whether the private member's bill is the right way to do it and so on and so forth, we will not have another chance to assert as a parliament that we support this principle. That is what people will get the opportunity to vote on in a few weeks.
I'm sorry about the experience of your relative, and I know lots of people have seen relatives die in very difficult situations. When I practice as a doctor, I tell you the people who I saw, who I thought would most benefit from something like this, weren't actually terminally ill. There are people who are who are suffering with chronic and quite severe illness, where the terminal illness wasn't a way out for them. And of course, in certain circumstances, people can make decisions which would result in the end of their life, and that being rational and appropriate. Those people I'm not worried about. I'm worried about the people who are making decisions which is linked to mental illness, which is why, as again, we have psychiatric services, and making sure these people are assessed and they get the appropriate help they need.
Which is what the panel is for. It's a multidisciplinary panel.
I mean, there will be a psychiatrist on the panel.
That's the whole
Does that
point.
reassure you in any way?
Well, the psychiatrist needs to assess the patient to start off with and needs to decide whether the mental health act is appropriate, which is one of the amendments that I put down. I think, just going back to Josh's point about our country and the status, we have a great history in terms of being right at the forefront when it comes to mental health and mental capacity legislation. Why we have not done this as a proper Law Commission review or something similar is completely beyond me. People often talk about other jurisdictions. Other jurisdictions have done this properly by reviewing it and doing the working out first, not having back of a fact packet amendments which are coming out at the last minute as the committee's voting things through. What I hope, and I've said this to Kim, I think she's driven the debate forwards. She's made a real impression in terms of getting this debate going. I want this debate to continue. And what I've suggested to her is that she withdraws the bill and she says, we've got it so far. Now let's have a commission. Let's have a review. Let's look at this properly. And then let's legislate with something that could actually work.
Would that be something that you would back?
I mean, I'm sorry to be so blunt about it, but I say this as a constituency MP. I spent a lot of time listening to my constituents on this. I think that lacks courage. I think it lacks a willingness to actually confront legislation that we have now. And, the irony is, you call the amendments back of a fag packet. What the proposal that Kim Ledbetter has set out today does exactly what you want it to, which is that it has a multidisciplinary panel on which a psychologist sits who assesses the mental well-being of the patient. But that sounds to me like an amendment that is exactly what you want, not something that's just drawn up on the back of a fag packet.
I really hope it is. But I don't know what's in the amendment because it hasn't been tabled and it's not been published. And right now, this morning, the committee is debating and voting on provisions in the bill and safeguards with reference to an amendment which nobody has seen. That seems inappropriate to me.
Can I just get a comment from both of you about what might happen to the bill in a very sort of practical way? 28 is the crucial number here. If 28 MPs change their minds and vote against the bill at its next stage before the whole House of Commons, it would fail and not become law. Do you think this change will be critical enough to persuade minds one way or the other, Grace?
I mean, I think we've heard today that there are clearly some major concerns about these safeguards having been watered down. There are also these, you know, I hate to say it, we've been being drawn off these topics of procedure, but there are these broader structural issues. How is the court system going to deal with this? How is the NHS going to deal with this? And I think a lot of people aren't going to be comfortable with that unless we see investment in the services that would be needed to make this happen. You said that we are a rich country. We have the capacity to give people a dignified death. Do we have the capacity to give them a dignified life? Because we are not doing that right now.
Kate, on the MPs, very briefly.
Certainly think it's possible that there could be a shift. As I said, I think it really breaks down trust that such a big change would be made after it was promised that this would be the ultimate safeguard. And for a lot of these MPs, they wanted to see what the final bill was going to look like. They haven't made up their mind.
Right, well, and there's still time, of course. Before we move on, just a reminder that we're on at the earlier time of 11:15 tomorrow. Set your alarm clocks for all the build-up to Prime Minister's questions, when Keir Starmer will, of course, be taking questions from the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch. Do join us all then tomorrow. Have a look at this headline, BBC News. You heard again in the headlines, Trump announces 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminium imports. He was in the headline signing an executive order to bring in the tariffs. He's very fond of those. He then read a statement setting out the thinking behind the policy. Let's take a look.
It's time for our great industries to come back to America. I want them back to America. This is the first of many, and you know what I mean by that. We're going to be doing others on other subjects, topics. Protecting our steel and aluminum industries is a must, and today I'm simplifying our tariffs on steel and aluminum so that everyone can understand exactly what it means. It's 25% without exceptions or exemptions, and that's all countries, no matter where it comes from, all countries.
All countries, he says there. Let's have a look at this tweet from Faisal Islam, the BBC's economics editor. No immediate UK retaliation to US imposition of 25% tariffs on steel and aluminium announced by the White House overnight, unlike Canada and the EU. Government meeting industry and unions today, many advocating joining G7 partners in retaliating. Government says cool heads required to avoid escalation. How should the government respond, Josh?
Well, I was in the US in 2016 when Trump first got elected, and a lot of the politics he's espousing, pro-worker, you know, protecting producers and so on, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that he's doing this, and I don't think it's a surprise to the UK government either. I think we need to see what's in the detail of what he said. You know, he's tweeted and
said all countries.
His statement. Yeah, I know, but they haven't actually published the detail of how the tariffs.
So you're hoping that the UK won't be on the list?
I have no unique insight into that whatsoever. I don't know. But the important thing is not to overreact to this. You know, tariffs are a normal part of the sort of economic politics. We had them. We did them for our agricultural producers in the mid-1800s with the Corn Laws. And the important thing for the UK to do is not react instinctively, take its time to listen to what's in our national interest, just as he's done with his.
Okay.
And see what's in it.
Well, Ben, do you agree with that? Cool heads, don't respond just yet with retaliatory tariffs.
Well, cool heads is always a good approach, but there's a certain irony because it's a bit difficult to criticise a foreign politician for putting taxes on business when this government has done exactly that to our own businesses with national employment employer rises. But look, trade wars end in trade deals. That's why trade deals are so important. I think. And Greg Hands, former trade minister, 4 times over, messaged earlier on Twitter what the UK should be doing is getting together the trade representatives from CPTPP, other international allies, and talking through how we're going to approaching that. And it looks to me, from what Josh has said and that announcement, that's what this government's going to do, and I think that makes sense.
But instinctively, to use your word, what would you do? Why shouldn't we put tariffs on imports from the States?
Well, forgive me, I'm not going to get drawn into sort of how to respond in this sort of trade context. I think well, no, because I've sort of answered. This needs to be very carefully thought through with conjunction with our international allies in terms of what's the best way of taking it forwards.
This needs to be contextualised, right? We really need to understand why Trump is doing this. Now, who are the countries that are going to be most affected by this? It is Canada and Mexico, which are the US's 2 largest trade partners in steel. Canada, the largest trade partner in aluminium. We saw a few weeks ago Trump threatening to announce 20% tariffs on both of those countries, imports from everywhere. Why? Okay, context. NAFTA. the trade deal that unites North America. Trump renegotiated that during his last term. He created the USMCA. Why? NAFTA has been extremely unpopular with both the left and the right saying it's responsible for deindustrialization, the left for exploitation of workers in Mexico and the kind of hollowing out of many communities. Trump renegotiated that, created USMCA, which had some provisions that were supposed to benefit the US.
Yeah.
That's coming up for renegotiation on some elements next year.
Yes.
He wants leverage with Canada and Mexico.
Fine, but what about here? But
that is an important context for how we are deciding to respond to this. I think the reason perhaps there haven't been immediate retaliation is because people think, right, well, maybe we can negotiate some sort of carve out for the UK. But bear in mind, we will be doing so from a very weak negotiating position.
Right.
And I think, if we're thinking about how to protect our industry, then that requires a much longer term strategy. It requires what we were promised,
that the steel industry
which was proper industrial
but the
strategy
steel
that we
industry
haven't got.
here in the UK has said it's going to have a devastating impact on the industry if those tariffs do go ahead, as promised, threatened by President Trump. What should the UK government do to protect the steel industry here?
Well, this is a question that we've been asking ourselves for an extremely long time, not just from tariffs, from China dumping tons of steel on world markets many years ago. There needs to be a proper industrial strategy. That means the government working with unions, working with these steel companies to make sure that they have access to, yes, the markets that they need to export to, but also investment, also a good workforce strategy.
Okay.
All of these things require long-term thinking.
They
we were
do,
promised a good industrial strategy, and Labour hasn't delivered on that.
Right. Well, in the short term, though, what should the government do? I mean, taking some of those factors into account, they will take time. But if the steel industry is saying we need protection now, should the UK government give it in the form of tariffs?
No, the government is absolutely right not to respond. This is the right course of action. First things first, the UK steel industry's #1 issue is by no means Trump's tariffs. This has been an unprofitable industry for a very long time. Look at the £500 million handout to Tata Steel last September. The UK needs to get serious about talking about its steel industry, no longer as a serious, profitable company, but perhaps if they want to continue to produce it for security reasons, and there's a case for that, something to be brought under defense. Like, let's have a real honest conversation about steel production in the UK. Then we look to Trump and his tariffs. I agree with Grace that Trump wants to negotiate. Actually, if you look at a lot of his actions, he clearly knows that tariffs backfire on your own communities, on your own citizens.
But does he?
Wants trade deals.
Does he accept that, or does he not think that they are good in their own right, not just as a negotiating ploy?
Well, look, this is a man who on the campaign trail was saying that tariff was his favorite word in the dictionary, apart from love and religion. Everything he says suggests that he loves tariffs, but he also likes to talk about a booming economy. He's promised to bring costs down for consumers. He's promised tax cuts. Tariffs and costs going down for consumers don't add up. And I would say crucially here, the reason you don't slap tariffs back on the US is because tariffs are a tax on your own civilians, on your own citizens, on your own business. The tariffs that Trump brought in 2016, which now look like the pregame, the warm-up to what's happening now, added roughly a conservative estimate $200 to every American household bill. You don't do it because you don't want to tax your own people.
Right. What do you make then of the EU certainly threatening to retaliate with tariffs?
Well, the EU is in a very different situation than we are, right? Because it is a big trading bloc that has relatively more leverage relative to the US. One thing I would say, though, is that the EU in particular will be looking at what's going on to the global economy because, these tariffs aren't just going to have localized domestic implications for individual economies. They are going to slow global growth in what is already a context of relatively low growth. The EU is in serious danger there because many of its economies are already in recession, and we're in danger of getting dragged down too unless our government does something about it.
Right. Josh, what should they do?
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing what Grace thinks of the industrial strategy that's soon going to be published because it's on its way. And one of the key elements of that strategy is energy. It's right that the most significant barrier on our domestic industrial production in this country is the price of energy, And bringing that cost down is absolutely vital to consumers and to industrial production. And I think, I teach my kids that if one of them pokes the other one in the eye, you don't just poke straight back. Sometimes you walk away, take a breath, and then come back later. And, it's absolutely right to take a breather, not just to come straight back and consider what's in our national interest.
Well, what's your reaction? I'm so sorry. What's your reaction then to this? We've just had it from BBC News that the UK and the US refusing to sign the International AI Declaration. What does that say about the relationship there between the UK and the US? This is the summit going on in Paris at the moment. We're trying to get some sort of agreement. They're not going to do it.
Well, I think it's a very good thing for our country that our Prime Minister has struck up a good, effective, strong working relationship with the President of the United States. You know, that's exactly what you would expect from a serious, credible Prime Minister of the UK, and that is what seems to have happened. I think, you know, my background is in AI and tech, and I think these AI declarations, this sort of geopolitics of AI, where we all say we're pro-inclusive AI, there's not that much that I think is underneath it, really. And I think a lot of the things that we need to do around AI, such as in our industrial strategy, such as the AI growth zones recently announced, those are where the core of our AI policy should be, less on these symbolic declarations.
Do you agree, Ben? The UK shouldn't have signed up and shouldn't be signing up to that international declaration on artificial intelligence?
Well, it depends what's in it. I don't know what exactly the declaration...
About inclusive AI.
What was in terms of, you know, whether it makes sense in our national interest. But I would agree with Joss, absolutely. The importance when you're looking at AI is to focus on energy, to focus on national resilience when it comes to our own data centres and how we're going about approaching that. Because AI, if the government's going to adopt it the way that it says in its ambitions, we need to make sure that we've got domestic infrastructure that can handle that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, you know, the essence of what we're doing is making it easier to build data centres, making it easier to build small modular reactors in this country, and making it easier to build wind farms. All of that is about building the infrastructure we need in the AI economy.
This is all about comparative advantage. The US and the UK think that they're going to have real markets here, and they don't want to be restrained by whatever restrictions the EU comes up with. I also personally think that's the reason that the EU is talking big on tariffs, because they know that on paper, Trump sees this, quote, trade deficit, and the EU is going to be in its targets. Now, on paper, for technical reasons, Trump looks at the UK and he sees a trade surplus and he likes it. So the UK, from that comparative advantage, is right to keep quiet. I'm not sure it is so flowery, frankly. I think it's a little bit more robust in terms of the way that these countries are just looking at their own situation and making a calculation.
Well, all this talk about tariffs, potential tariffs, and how the UK responds adds to a certain feeling of uncertainty for businesses here, following on from the budget as they continue to respond and adapt to changes that are coming down the line very shortly, like the rise in employer national insurance contributions before they come in at the beginning of April. Let's speak to Deirdre McGettrick, CEO and founder of YouFurnish.com, which is a search and comparison website for furniture. Welcome to you, Deirdre. How are you approaching the changes in the budget?
Hi, thanks for having me. Yes, so it's been quite I suppose, a shock when it came in at first. We had already looked at finalising our budgets for 2025, and all of a sudden there is a gap in there. And as a business that is a scale-up business, we're on a path to profitability. I've got a bit of a conundrum around how do I fill the gap in my budget versus now what the reality is going to be. And you're looking at three different options. I'm either going to raise more investment to plug it, I'm going to have to cut back on costs, which is going to be likely with employees, or you are then looking at how can you increase your revenue, and that will increase costs for consumers in the UK.
Right. Well, Deirdre, let me just get an immediate response, particularly to one of those options, Josh, which is cutting employees or not recruiting any more people.
Well, the big picture here is that for a long time in this country, unemployment has been relatively low and investment has been shockingly low and productivity growth has been shockingly low. And what that has meant is that the wages of British workers have grown really slowly. And if what this change is doing is incentivising businesses to invest in capital and invest in their business, that is a good thing. There is no doubt whatsoever that things are tough for business at the moment, and they are tough for workers too. But actually investing in technology, investing in capital in the long run is exactly what our economy needs.
Deirdre, do you want to respond to that?
I do think it's a valid point. It's definitely one of the strategies that we are looking at as a company is where can we bring in automation? How can we use AI to free up capacity within the team so that we can actually be more efficient? It's about sort of working smarter, not harder. I think the real trouble about it is that just the time frame of which we've had to implement and deal with it doesn't always allow us to implement changes in technology quick enough to plug the gaps.
Ben?
So most businesses and business representatives speak to me tell me that they don't need government sort of sledgehammers to encourage them to think very carefully about how they balance their budget and how they're they're being as efficiently and effective as possible. I mean, I think it's a bizarre statement, quite frankly, that a tax on employment and a tax on businesses is in some way helping businesses. I suspect, it might be worth certainly come and speak to the businesses in my constituency.
To many of them, and incentivising investment.
It's certainly not the way
that
my businesses are looking at it, and particularly when they're having to make these difficult decisions about making people redundant. I wish during the general election the Labour Party had been honest about its plans to raise taxes, and rather than committing itself to the big core pledges that we made, it didn't do that. I think your party still would have won the general election if it had said that it was going to raise other types of taxes, and it could have used those levers in a more sensible way than this, quite frankly, economic madness in terms of taxing businesses, which are our growth engines. And now we just see all the problems that come as a result of it.
It's economic madness, particularly when growth is your core mission.
Well, I think you've just heard from Deirdre, who, by the way, I prompted to check out your business, and it looks extremely useful, and I would urge everyone else to. But I think you just heard that it's not a sledgehammer. You are making the marginal cost of labour a bit more expensive in order to fill a whopping great black hole left by your government, who essentially wrecked the nation's finances. Now,
how much does the Chagos Islands go towards that black hole?
To be fair,
that really is a
neither of parties covered themselves in glory before the election when it came to actually honesty, delivering what they were going to say they would deliver. But there is a broader point here, which is that you mentioned there you are increasing the marginal cost of labour. That is going to have a significant effect on the everyday economy, which is where most people work, where most people, where lots of people have small businesses. For that reason, I actually think this is a bad tax. There were lots of other tax levers that Rachel Reeves had available to her. There was a huge campaign backed by sections of the Labour movement, backed by, vast swathes of British society to introduce a wealth tax. That was something that was a really coordinated campaign. Rachel Reeves, instead of introducing a wealth tax, she decided, right, we are going to actually not go ahead with the taxes on private equity that we were promised. We're going to dodge this, closing this loophole on non-doms. And instead of taxing the wealthy, we are going to impose a tax that is going to harm ordinary people.
Where are you, Kate? Because listening to Deirdre saying that actually it's making her think again in terms of how to work smartly when it comes to her company. Is productivity going to improve against the backdrop of the Bank of England governor just cutting growth forecasts?
Look, when you automate, you do tend to get a real boost in productivity, but that has to be an organic process, because the idea behind it is that that automation is going to help people to do new jobs more effectively. It's not the idea that you wipe out these jobs overnight. And I think you might make interesting points about automation, but the fact that businesses report to be cutting jobs and staff at the rate that they were during the financial crash is probably a red flag, not a green flag, in terms of how quickly we're going to move into this more productive, more automated society. And I would just say that if we're going to talk about that dreaded stagflation, and there are growing whispers that it's coming, that would mean growth on the floor, which it is. That would mean inflation rising, which it is, and it would mean rising unemployment. That's the factor that has been saving multiple governments, and I wonder how Labour will respond to it.
Well, Deirdre, before I go back to Josh, what's your response from what you've heard here in the studio?
I think it's really tough for businesses, and particularly with the increase in minimum wage as well, which doesn't necessarily affect ours because we're quite a high level of skill within the technology company that we operate. So I think it's just, really all businesses are looking for is certainty and time to plan for these elements. And I do agree that, it's a really good opportunity for businesses to look really hard at where we can bring in efficiencies. But I don't think as well, given the headlines that you're seeing from the bigger companies as well, that they're able to bring in those efficiencies quick enough to save jobs of people today.
Right. Well, actually, the Metro headline, I don't know if we can show it because we're talking to you, Deirdre. Tesco, Sainsbury's and M&S warn High Street faces 300,000 job cuts by 2028. Are you optimistic about the future or not in the near term, Deirdre?
I'm an entrepreneur, so there's always a silver lining.
Deirdre, thank you very much for joining us. But what about those job losses, Josh?
Well, that optimism was infectious because those job losses are forecast projections into the future. What, in fact, has happened so far, we've created about 70,000 jobs since we came into office. Wages are growing at the fastest rate in 3 years. And the IMF forecasts us to be, for the next few years, the fastest growing economy in Europe.
And a think tank says living standards aren't going to recover until 2027. That growth isn't broad-based enough.
And on that, it's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me. And as you heard, we'll be back at the earlier time of 11:15 tomorrow.